Chapter 3 Quillerin, wearing the newer and darker of his two suits, went alone to the Valentine Ball at the Art Club, which, he discovered, was called the Turp and Chisel. The club had originated 40 years before in the back room of a blind pig. Now it occupied the top floor of the best hotel. Its membership was large and fashionable, and the impecunious bohemians who had founded the fraternity had become old, staid, and full of dollars. Upon his arrival at the ball, Quillerin was able to wander unrecognized about the premises of the Turp and Chisel. He found a sumptuous lounge, a dining room, and a very busy bar. The games room, paneled with old barnwood, offered everything, from darts to dominoes. In the ballroom, tables were draped with red and white cloths, and an orchestra played innocuous tunes. He asked for the Halape table, and was greeted by Sandra Halape, wearing a white kimono of stiff embroidered silk. Exaggerated makeup made her almond eyes even more exotic. "I was afraid you wouldn't come," she said, holding his hand long after the handshake had ended, and delighting him with a rippling laugh. "The invitation was irresistible, Mrs. Halape," said Quillerin. Then he surprised himself by bending over her hand and brushing it with his mustache. "Please call me Sandy," she said. "Did you come alone to a lover's ball?" "Yes. I represent Narcissus." Sandy trilled with merriment. "You newspaper people are so clever." She was lyrically tall and lovely, Quillerin decided, and tonight she was charmingly relaxed, as wives often are when their husbands are absent. "Cal is chairman of the ball," she said, "and he's flitting around, so you can be my date." Her eyes were roguish, as well as exotic. Then Sandy, changing to a formal tone that rang hollow, introduced the others who were seated at the table. They were members of Cal's committee, she explained pointedly. A Mr. and Mrs. Riggs or Biggs were in French period costume. A short, fleshy couple named Bookwalter, who seemed to be having a dull time, were garbed as peasants. There was also May Sisler, art reporter from the other newspaper. Quillerin gave her a fraternal bow, at the same time estimating that she was 10 years past retirement age. May Sisler gave him a bony hand and said in a thin voice, "Your Mr. Mount Clemens is a very naughty boy, but you look like a nice young man." "Thank you," said Quillerin. "No one has called me a young man for 20 years. "You'll like your new job," she predicted. "You'll meet lovely people." Sandy leaned close to Quillerin and said, "You look so romantic in that mustache. I wanted Cal to grow one so he would look halfway grown up, but he resisted the suggestion. He looks like such an infant, don't you think so?" She laughed musically. Quillerin said, "It's true, he appears youthful." "I think he's retarded somehow. In another few years, people will think he's my son. Won't that be crushing?" Sandy gave Quillerin an adoring look. "Are you going to ask me to dance?" "Cal is a terrible dancer. He thinks he's a killer, but he's really a clod on the dance floor." "Can you dance in that costume?" Sandy's stiff white kimono was bound about the middle with a wide black obi. More white silk was draped over her straight dark hair. "Oh, sure." She squeezed Quillerin's arm as they walked to the dance floor. "Do you know what my costume represents?" Quillerin said no. "Cal's in a black kimono. We're the young lovers in a snowy landscape." "Who are they?" "Oh, you know. The famous print by Hironobu." "Sorry, I'm a dunce when it comes to art." Quillerin felt he could be debonair about the admission, because at that moment he was leading Sandy expertly through a foxtrot enhanced by a few Quillerin flourishes. "You're a fun dancer," she said. It takes real coordination to foxtrot to a cha-cha. But we must do something about your art education. Would you like me to tutor you?" "I don't know if I could afford you. On my salary," he said, and Sandy's laughter could be heard above the orchestra. "How about the little lady from the other newspaper? Is she an art expert?" "Her husband was a camouflage artist in World War I," said Sandy. "I guess that makes her an expert." "And who are the rest of the people at your table?" "Riggs is a sculptor. He does stringy, emaciated things that are shown at the Lambeth Gallery. They look like grasshoppers. So does Riggs when you come to think of it. The other couple, the Bookwalters, are supposed to be Picasso's famous pair of lovers. Can't tell they're in costume. They always dress like peasants." Sandy turned up her nicely tilted nose. "I can't stand her. She thinks she's such an egghead. Her husband teaches art at Penniman School, and he's having a one-man show at the West Side Gallery. He's a vegetable, but he does lovely watercolors." Then she frowned. "I hope newspaper men aren't eggheads. When Cal told me to... Oh, well, never mind. I talk too much. Let's just dance." Quillerin lost his partner shortly after, when a surly young man cut in. He was wearing a torn t-shirt and had the manners of a hoodlum. The face was familiar. Later, back at the table, Sandy said, "That was Tom, our houseboy. He's supposed to be Stanley what's-his-name from that Tennessee Williams play, and his date is around here somewhere, dressed in a pink negligee. Tom is a boor, but Cal thinks he has talent, and so he's putting the kid through art school. Cal does a lot of wonderful things. You're going to write an article about him, aren't you?" "If I can collect enough material," said Quillerin. "He's difficult to interview. Perhaps you could help me." "I'd love it! Did you know Cal is chairman of the State Council on Art? I think he wants to be the first professional artist to make the White House. He'll probably get there, too. He lets nothing stop him." She paused and became thoughtful. "You ought to write an article about the old man at the next table." "Who's he?" "They call him Uncle Waldo. He's a retired butcher who paints animals. He never held a paintbrush until he was 69. "Where have I heard that before?" Quillerin said. "Oh, sure, every senior citizen wants to be a Grandma Moses, but Uncle Waldo is really talented, even if Georgie doesn't think so." "Who's Georgie?" "You know Georgie, your precious art critic." "I haven't met the man yet. What's he like?" "He's a real stinker, that's what he's like. When he reviewed Uncle Waldo's one-man show, he was absolutely cruel." "What did he say?" "He said Uncle Waldo should go back to operating a meat market and leave the cows and bunny rabbits to kids, who draw them with more imagination and honesty. He said Uncle Waldo butchered more livestock on canvas than he ever did in the meat business. Everyone was furious. Lots of people wrote letters to the editor. But the poor old man took it hard and stopped painting. It was a crime. He used to paint very charming primitives. I understand his grandson, who's a truck driver, went to the newspaper office and threatened to beat up George Bonneville Mount Clemens. And I don't blame him. Your critic is completely irresponsible." "Has he ever reviewed your husband's work?" Quillerin asked, with his best expression of innocence. Sandy shuddered. He's written some vicious things about Cal, just because Cal is a commercial artist and successful. Mount Clemens classifies commercial artists with house painters and paper hangers. Actually, Cal can draw better than any of those arty blotch and dribble kids who call themselves abstract expressionists. Not one of them could draw a glass of water." Sandy frowned and fell silent, and Quillerin said, "You're prettier when you smile." She obliged with a burst of laughter. "Look, isn't that a panic? Cal is dancing with Mark Antony." Quillerin followed her pointing finger to the dance floor, where Cal Halape, in black Japanese kimono, was guiding a husky Roman warrior through a slow foxtrot. The face under Anthony's helmet was bold-featured, but soft. "That's Butchie Bolton," said Sandy. "She teaches sculpture at the art school. Welded metal and all that sort of thing. She and her roommate came as Antony and Cleopatra. Isn't that a scream? Butchie welded her own armor. It looks like a couple of truck fenders." Quillerin said, "The paper should have sent a photographer. We should be getting pictures of all this." Sandy did some acrobatics with her eyebrows and said, "Zoe Lambreth was supposed to handle publicity for the ball, but I guess she's only good at getting publicity for herself." "I'm going to phone the picture desk," said Quillerin, "and see if they'll send over a man." Half an hour later, Odd Bunsen, who was working the 1 to 11 shift, arrived with a 35mm reflex camera hanging around his neck and the usual cigar between his teeth. Quillerin met him in the foyer and said, "Be sure to get a good shot of Cal and Sandra Hallipay." Odd said, "You're telling me. They love to get their noodles in the paper." Try to get everybody in pairs. They're dressed up as famous lovers. Othello and Desdemona, Lolita and Humbert, Adam and Eve. "Crazy," said Odd Bunsen as he readied his camera. "How long do you have to hang around here, Jim?" "Just long enough to see who wins the costume prizes and phone something into the desk." "Why don't you meet me at the press club for a nightcap? I can quit after I print these." Back at the Hallipay table, Sandy introduced Quillerin to an impressive woman in a beaded evening dress. "Mrs. Duxbury," Sandy explained, "is the most important collector in the city. You should write an article about her collection. It's 18th century English. Gainsborough and Reynolds, you know." Mrs. Duxbury said, "I'm not anxious to have my collection publicized, Mr. Quillerin, unless it will help you personally in your new position. Frankly, I am overjoyed to welcome you among us." Quillerin bowed. "Thank you. It's a completely new field for me." "I trust your presence here means that the Daily Fluxion has at last come to its senses and dropped Mount Clemens." "No," said Quillerin. "We're simply expanding our coverage. Mount Clemens will continue to write critical reviews." "What a pity. We were all hoping the newspaper would dismiss that horrid man." A fanfare of trumpets from the stage announced the presentation of costume prizes, and Sandy said to Quillerin, "I've got to collect Cal for the judging in the Grand March. Are you sure you won't stay longer?" "Sorry. I have to file my copy. But don't forget, you're going to help me write a profile on your husband." "I'll phone you and invite myself to lunch," said Sandy, giving the newsman an affectionate hug. "It will be fun." Quillerin moved to the back of the room and jotted down names as the winners were announced. And he was looking for a telephone when a woman's voice, soft and low, said, "Aren't you the new man from the Daily Fluxion?" His mustache tingled. Women's voices sometimes affected him that way, and this voice was like caressing fingers. "I'm Zoe Lambreth," she said, "and I'm afraid I failed miserably in my assignment. I was supposed to notify the newspaper about this ball, and it slipped my mind completely. I'm getting ready for a one-man show and working awfully hard, if you'll accept a lame excuse. I hope you're not being neglected. Are you getting all the information you need?" "I think so. Mrs. Hallipay has been looking after me." "Yes, I noticed," Zoe said, with a slight tightening of well-shaped lips. "Mrs. Hallipay was very helpful." Zoe's eyebrows flickered. "I dare say." "You're not in costume, Mrs. Lambreth." "No, my husband didn't care to come tonight, and I just dropped in for a few minutes. I wish you would visit the Lambreth Gallery someday and meet my husband. Both of us would like to help you in any way we can." "I'm going to need help. This is brand new territory for me," Quillerin said, and then slyly he added, Mrs. Halliday has offered to supervise my art education. Oh dear, said Zoe, with an intonation that suggested mild distress. Don't you approve? Well, Sandra is not the most knowledgeable of authorities. Forgive me. Sooner or later you'll find out that artists are notorious cats. Zoe's large brown eyes were being disarmingly frank, and Quillerin drowned in them momentarily. But I'm really sincere in my concern for you, she went on. I wouldn't want to see you misdirected. Much of the work being produced today in the name of art is spurious at its worst and shoddy at its best. You should insist on knowing the credentials of your advisors. What would you suggest? Come and visit the Lambeth Gallery, she urged, and her eyes echoed the invitation. Quillerin pulled in his waistline and entertained the idea of losing a few pounds, beginning tomorrow. Then, he made another attempt to find a telephone. The Grand March was over, and the guests were circulating. Word had spread about the club that the Daily Fluxion's new reporter was attending the party, and that he was easily recognized by his prominent mustache. Consequently, numerous strangers approached Quillerin and introduced themselves. Each one wished him well, and followed with something uncomplimentary about George Bonnefille Mount Clemens. Those who were art dealers added brief commercials for their galleries. Artists mentioned their forthcoming exhibitions. The laymen invited Quillerin to come and see their private collections any time, and to bring a photographer if he wished. Among those who hailed the newsman was Cal Halliday. Come out to the house for dinner some evening, he said. Bring the whole family. Now the drinking commenced in earnest, and the party grew boisterous. The greatest commotion could be heard in the games room, and Quillerin followed the crowd in that direction. He found the room packed with laughing guests, standing rib to rib, with barely enough room to raise a highball glass, and the center of attention was Mark Antony. She was standing on a chair. Without a helmet, Mark Antony was more nearly a woman, pudgy-faced, with a short haircut set in tight waves. Step right up, folks, she was barking. Try your skill. Quillerin squeezed into the room. The crowd, he discovered, was focusing its attention on a game of darts. Players were trying their aim at a life-size sketch of a man, chalked on the barnwood wall with all features of the anatomy explicitly delineated. Step right up, folks, the woman warrior was chanting. Doesn't cost a cent. 1 chance apiece. Who wants to play Kill the Critic? Quillerin decided he had had enough. His mustache was feeling vaguely uncomfortable. He made a discreet exit, telephoned his story to the paper, and then joined Odd Bunsen at the press club. Mount Clemens must be a pill, he said to the photographer. Do you read his column? Who reads? Said Odd. I just look at the pictures and check my credit line. He seems to cause a lot of trouble. Do you know anything about the situation at the art museum? I know they've got a cute chick in the check room, Odd said, and some crazy nudes on the second floor. Interesting, but that's not what I mean. The museum just lost $1 million grant from some foundation, and the director was fired as a result. That's what I heard at the party tonight. And they say the whole ruckus was caused by the Daily Fluxion's critic. I wouldn't doubt it. He's always raising hell in the photo lab. He phones in and tells us what he wants photographed for his column. Then we have to go to the galleries to make the pics. You should see the garbage he expects us to photograph. Last week, I went back to the Lambeth Gallery twice, and I still couldn't get a shot worth printing. How come? The painting was black and navy blue, for Pete's sake. My print looked like a coal bin on a dark night, and the boss thought it was my fault. Old Monty's always beefing about our photographs. If I ever get a chance, I'd like to bust a speed graphic over his skull.